I'd like to begin by saying a very special welcome to and thank you to Uncle Max for that wonderful smoking ceremony, which is the official welcome to our conference, which is commencing tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and the waters we meet upon, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Tonight's keynote address will be delivered by Frances Morris, the director of Tate Modern. It's the start of our conference, The Forever Now, Contemporary Art Collections in the 21st Century, which takes place tomorrow and Saturday with over 25 national and international speakers, accompanying the relaunch of our collection upstairs on level 2, which I hope many of you will have seen by now. After Frances's keynote talk, Professor Mark Ledbury of the University of Sydney, Director of the Power Institute, will facilitate a Q&A, so get thinking with some nice questions for Frances. I'd like to thank Qantas and our government sponsors, Arts New South Wales and the Australia Council for all their support. And now to our guest speaker. Frances Morris is the director of Tate Modern. She's the first woman and the first Brit to take the helm of this august institution. She's played a key role in the development of Tate, having joined as a curator in 1987. She was head of displays at Tate Modern from 2000 to 2006, and so played a critical role in the original reopening of Tate Modern. She was then Director of Collections, International Art, until April 2016, when she was appointed to her current role. She's continually worked to reimagine how Tate might interpret and present its collections, and has been instrumental in developing its international reach and its representation of women and artists from different cultural backgrounds. Frances was jointly responsible for the initial presentations of the opening collection displays at Tate Modern in 2000, which radically transformed the way museums present the story of modern art. She's curated landmark exhibitions, many of which were large-scale international collaborations, including 3 major retrospectives of women artists, Louise Bourgeois, Yayoi Kusama, and Agnes Martin in 2015. I was delighted myself to be present when the new Tate Modern opened earlier this year and to see the incredible results of Frances's work over the years on display. That's what she's going to talk to us a little bit about tonight. So please join me in welcoming Frances Morris.
Thank you, Lisanne, and thank you everybody at MCA who's made my visit here this week so enormously interesting and warm and friendly. It's been an absolute delight. I can recognize many of you in the audience, which just about stops you being from as intimidating as you otherwise might look. Good. That's what I'm going to talk about, really. I'm starting with an image which shows the new Tate Modern. In the front of the slide, you see the old building, designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott in the 1930s, finished in the 1960s, and behind it, a new building by the architects Herzog and de Meuron. And those two buildings are knit together in a carapace of bricks, which brings together really very profoundly different architectural styles, which speak to different worldviews and different times. The building sits in a landscape which also demonstrates several hundred years of urban evolution, clashes of cultures, maybe, but spanning the whole of South London, one of the most cosmopolitan communities in the world, representing both the 1%, those people who've arrived as a result partly of the regenerational impact of Tate Modern, and the rest of the community further south perhaps, and largely untouched as yet by the advent of global investment in real estate and dominated by large pockets of social deprivation and over half a century of immigration from Africa, the Caribbean, South Asia, and more recently the Middle East and Eastern Europe. So the building and the environment are both themselves metaphors for the museum in the 21st century. They serve a huge range of audiences and cultures, and it's full of inherent contradictions, utopias, dystopias, blind alleys, and possibilities. So the new Tate Modern is just one of hundreds of new museum projects that have been realised across the world in the last decade. And of course, MCA realised this adjacent new building only a few years ago. And over the way, the Art Gallery of New South Wales is about to embark on its own expansion. And I think I hope for those directors of those institutions too when I say that more important for all of us than the bricks and the mortar, and the reason I'm not going to show you any more gorgeous shots of our new building, despite the fact I completely love it, are the other buildings that we as curators are involved in. So they are building the collections and, even more crucially, building audiences. I love this juxtaposition of two works from the Tate's collection. It says a huge amount to me. It speaks to me of what I've been trying to do for all my career at Tate Modern, but it also sets out, I think, the challenge for Tate and other museums like Tate, which span such a huge range of material and diversity, covering over a century, over a century of artistic innovation. So the work on your left by Wassily Kandinsky, Cossacks from 1910 to 11, and acquired by the Tate in 1938, only 20 years after Tate started buying what was then called modern foreign art. And on the other side, one of the very first live works to be acquired by the museum in 2008 by Tanya Bruguera, Tatlin's Whisper. So in the Kandinsky, the story, a key work from the formal Western abstraction, from the early era of the avant-garde, a moment where artistic innovation mirrored a period of profound political upheaval. It's a flat painting, the image disappears into abstraction, but as a physical object, it's static, it sits on the wall. It's domestic in scale and passive, physically passive in relation to its audience. The only way the audience can engage with the work is in a one-to-one relationship bound by the space in which it hangs. This was a time when men held sway and the canon was secure. This is the beginning of the history of modernism. The other image, of course, demonstrates a work of art that's live and it's ephemeral, it's noisy, it's aggressive, it's moving, it's unsettling. It was authored by a woman, Tanya Bruguera, from a third world country, Cuba, and made at a moment in time when the old divisions between disciplines were collapsing, and when more and more artists have been turning to ephemeral, participatory, event-based practice. So these two works show the distance traveled in the art world over the course of the century, and I suppose point to a principal challenge faced by museums of modern and contemporary art everywhere: how to be a museum of modern art while embracing the contemporary. So of course there is an answer to that question, and I'm going to talk through, in a way, my own history at Tate and the history of what we've been doing with the collection for the last 20 years or so to try and unpick where that solution might lie. Of course, Tate is, in essence, was born out of the Tate Gallery of Art, established towards the end of the 19th century, and this is a picture of its principal home on Millbank in southwest London, taken in 1994, before anybody had even heard of Tate Modern or even dreamt that it might one day exist. It's a classical 19th century building. And the collection that was started initially, as I say, in the 19th century, was to begin with a collection of British art from around 1500 to the present day. And in 1917, just at the moment where the Bolsheviks were leaping over the barricades in Red Square, a very small revolution took place in Britain, and the trustees of the Tate Gallery decided that they should collect foreign art. So the collection of foreign art dates from 1917, and I'm beginning to think and be rather excited about how we might celebrate that centenary next year. But principally, this big, rather rambling collection is of two types. The British collection, I think rather like the collection that we see here at the MCA, is a broad survey collection of British art. So all the highlights, the big stars, but the kind of byways, the kind of the cul-de-sacs, the no-through roads as well, the kind of story of art in all its glory, but warts and all. In contrast to that, the international collection, as I said, modern foreign art, as we started to collect it from 1917, was much more of a highlights collection. And it kind of reflected, I suppose, as all collections do, the tastes, passions, deficiencies, obsessions, relationships, hobby horses of the directors and the curators that ran Tate over that time. But above all, I think it reflected the taste of British collectors and British artists and the fashions of the marketplace over many decades. So what the foreign collection did historically was really reflect the strengths of British art. So British artists were very curious and interested in surrealism. We have a great surrealist collection. British artists after the Second World War looked to Paris, then they looked to New York for their role models. So we have really strong holdings of post-war French and post-war American painting. So it was an international collection that very much fed off a story of British art and British art in the modern world. And of course, the history that underpinned that, particularly as it was further articulated or more strongly articulated in the UK in the post-war era, was the history that underpinned the founding and the early growth period of the great Museum of Modern Art in New York. Alfred Barr, the founding director, was assiduous in his research in defining a kind of a history that would accommodate the great moments of European art and would feed into the engagement and development of American modern art in the 1930s and 40s. And he really was the only individual in the course of the 20th century who set out in a very compelling way a kind of history of art as a route map that could therefore be followed. And I don't think he did it to be followed, but he did it to explain and articulate the reason for the Museum of Modern Art's collection. And that image that you see widely reproduced since that time underpinned then the subsequent development of European and North American museums, and indeed Tate Modern's own. When I first joined the Tate in the late 1980s, this timeline, and it's the way it was then fed through into a reading of the post-Second World War era in Europe and America, really provided us with a sort of shopping list of what to acquire for the collection, and the collection was seen as something that should, in space and through physical objects, illustrate this known history that was capable of communicating and capable of learning. So it was a very sort of didactic, authorial model. And therefore, we very much as curators, spent our time working forcefully to fill in the gaps. And it was one of the first questions I was asked during my interview for my curatorial role, then called assistant keeper at Tate, is what gaps would you fill first? So there was this lovely idea that you could have kind of aim at completion. But of course, what that model didn't take into account was that the finishing line is endlessly receding in time, because it didn't take into account the ever-present necessity for history to underpin our understanding of contemporary art. And that was something that I think at Tate, Nicholas Sirota, when he became director, about that time really understood. And one of his first tasks as director was to rethink the whole display of the collection. And I think, so my very earliest years at the Tate, I inherited this idea of a collection that was could be finished. And then I suddenly had this director who threw all the cards in the air and said, actually, it's not finishing. We can reinvent the world. We can rethink art history with our collection. So this was Nick's, I'm showing you this. I found it in my file only a few weeks ago. I think it's fantastic. I mean, here's a hand-drawn plan of the first rehang of the collection in 1992. And a couple of things that respect of contemporary practice and the museum today, and my role, are immediately evident to me. Of course, I counted up the number of women straight away, and at first I couldn't find any, but you can see one or two women lurking. Horn, I'd like to think is Rebecca Horn there, and I think somewhere Barbara Hepworth may be lurking. But what Nick really did was try and draw attention to the fact that history is not just a sequence of individual works of art. It's the stories of individual lives and their engagement with their time and their place. And so therefore, this was an installation that was really built around artist practice rather than some sort of schematic notion of an abstract history. So shortly after that, we took the decision that we should expand the Tate, find a new way of new space to show the developing contemporary collection, and this was the site that was identified for that expansion. This is the picture of Tate Modern, the building designed by Giles Gilbert Scott in the 1930s, completed in the 1960s, decommissioned in the 1970s, that had stood empty for over 2 decades. By the time we opened Tate Modern, the landscape at Tate had changed. We were no longer a single Tate, Tate Britain. We were no longer a pair of Tates, Tate Britain, Tate Modern, but also 2 other regional Tates. On the bottom, Tate Liverpool, and just behind me, Tate St Ives. And I think this is an important structural change in the Tate, because from being one collection available to one museum, one building, we became one collection that would be shared across 4 Tates. So the realities of building the collection were that no longer were we building a collection for a kind of a known history. We were no longer building the collection for a particular known set of galleries. We were building a collection to be available across 4 sites for 4 very different agendas. And we had the remarkable good fortune during the end of the 90s, a small group of us, to absent ourselves from our daily duties and take ourselves away and occupy, metaphorically, the place of André Malraux. And here he is reviewing photographs selected for his great work, The Voices of Silence. So we were able to think about art history and the practice of art without regard to the collection itself, without regard to a particular known history, and rehearsed in theoretical terms and in discussion with colleagues from learning and artists, other art historians and curators, what would be the options for retelling the history of art at the end of the 20th century, at the dawn of a new century. And of course, the imperative behind that idea of rethinking everything that we had done was, of course, first of all, the opportunity. Museums rarely get this opportunity to reinvent themselves, but we had a complete tabula rasa with a new building coming up. But also the realization that towards the end of that period, that it was just not possible any longer to talk about history as a single narrative of art, confined to a single place, and, as it were, governed by a single group of people. Art, as evidenced in the proliferation of biennials, triennials, art fairs, major events across the world, was becoming more and more global, that it was no longer possible to think about a sort of single center or a cluster of centers, that, polycentrism, I love that word, was the kind of the name of the game. But beyond that, artists were working in ways that simply defied the traditional genres of art, but also defied the traditional division of art practice into the kind of conventional categories of painting, photography, video, sculpture, and so on. So amongst my generation, and very much fed by the kind of new art history, written very broadly, both from Western and non-Western sources, there was a generational demise in the belief of a single master narrative. There was that collapse of hierarchies between high and low. Artists were making art for museums at the same time as they were producing records or doing advertising work. Art was being made on the street, so a collapse between art and popular culture. So with all that in mind, we came up with a scheme to show Tate's collection in what turned out to be controversial and a radical rethink of the conventional narrative. And what we did was we didn't dispense with time. Our solution was full of time, but we did put on one side the notion of a linear chronology as a kind of guide through the displays. What we wanted to do is demonstrate to our audiences, and we thought about our audiences in very broad terms. We thought about them as the people who came off the street, and we thought about them as the people who are teaching art history at the University of London. We wanted to try and create a dialogue between past and present that would allow people who felt comfortable with the early avant-garde, Impressionism, for example. We wanted to encourage those people to engage with more radical, perhaps challenging work. We also wanted the young kids that came in from the street who would be really interested in sort of some of the cooler installations to have access through them to some more historical material. So it was an idea of creating a comfortable, opening, generous doorway into the experience of art. And we wanted to show, I suppose, above all, that terms of reference that defined modernism, the kind of terminology of art, were easily accessible through more general terms. So each of our 4 stories took one kind of notion of a kind of classic genre, the still life, the nude, history painting, and landscape, and then played it out over the course of the century. So history connected with society, so contemporary political work, how they connect with early 20th century history painting, how artists' interest in the environment could tie back into a more classical interest in the landscape, how artists using the body had roots historically back into traditions and genres of the nude, how real life and artists interested in the environment, for example, or object practices might feed back into an understanding, more traditional understanding of still life. And this fed into a type of display that's become sort of almost like a kind of signature style of Tate Modern, the juxtaposition, the pairings. And in our opening displays, some of these were pairings of artists who operated at the same time but might never have spoken to each other, where the pairing encouraged you to find new readings or expand readings of familiar or unfamiliar work. So this juxtaposition of Newman and Giacometti, for example, we put together one artist working in New York in pure abstraction, another in Paris in this atelierated figuration, to try and encourage a reading of the figure in the Barnett Newman and a sense of engagement in sort of the spiritual space in Giacometti. This is one of the more controversial pairings when we opened. People were shocked by the juxtaposition of Claude Monet, normally seen on a chocolate box, with this sort of large-scale, aggressive expressionist work by Richard Long. But Richard Long made the work in the gallery in response to the Monet, and of course the juxtaposition was really to tease out the radicalism of Monet's art at that time. Late Monet, these paintings that were decentered, where the painting spills off the edge of the canvas, the sense that art invades the space in exactly the same way that land art leaves the gallery and expands into the space of the environment. We also took some of those familiar isms, those moments of sort of paradigmatic innovation in modern art, and showed how they played out across the rest of the century. So the presence of history in contemporary practice, and here was a display called The Subversive Object that looked at the legacies and indeed the life of surrealism in contemporary work. So Dali's Lobster Telephone, but work by Jeff Koons, and in front an early work by Jake and Dinos Chapman, Lucas Samaras. So the idea that we're trying to open up the discussion and the history of art and liberate it from those sort of boxes that historians and curators had confined it to. One of the key things that governed our thinking, and that has always governed my thinking actually, is the way artists talk about their work. And we realized in talking to artists that artists don't simply look over their shoulder, see what the person behind them has done and think, oh, I need to do one better or one fresher or newer. You know, that artists are time travelers, that they go back many centuries in their references and they pick and choose. And therefore, one cannot simply see each artist as a successive innovation from the previous generation. It just doesn't work like that. So that was the opening display of Tate Modern. And of course, centered at the heart of many of these displays were the great single artist monographic rooms. And if there's anything else that we've done at Tate, I think it's have this extreme commitment to giving artists their own spaces so that you can have an exclusive, immersive experience with a single artist, and so that the artist's voice, through all the constraints or narratives that the curator lays on top, is preeminent. But all this work, all this innovation, all this curatorial achievement, all this reflection of contemporary creativity and innovation and a kind of the new art history, nevertheless was confined in our collection to works made in Western Europe and North America. And of course, this was a moment in time where it was more and more evident that great art was being made across the world. Great art was being made regardless of geography. And of course, collections take a long time to change, and it wasn't immediately apparent how we should change our collection, though as we were buying contemporary art, we were buying more and more art from outside that NATO territory. But our exhibition program really fed the beginnings of exploring what it might mean to think about a wider geography. And there are 3 exhibitions that I think at that time were really important. One was Century City, which we made in 2001, just after we opened, which was an exhibition that looked at the effervescent moments of creativity in, I think it was 9 cities across the world in the course of the 20th century. And those cities were not all in Europe and North America. So Moscow was a city, Mumbai was a city, Lagos was there, Rio. And it was an extraordinary exhibition that suddenly, in place of this very conventional kind of, West Europe to North America dialogue, suddenly we had this incredible notion of many centers of innovation and artistic creativity. And then, of course, we began making shows of contemporary practice, and those just completely were unable not to celebrate art from across the world. So Time Zones, a show that looked at innovative forms of time-based media, and Commonwealth, an exhibition mostly of large-scale sculptural installations, again, work from Africa, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia, and so on, a celebration of diversity and globalization. As a result, we took the decision that we could no longer confine our collection development to that old geographical framework of North America and Western Europe. So in a period of around 6 years, we developed a funding strategy, and we can talk about this in detail later, that brought together groups of interested people, philanthropists, connected to Tate, or who we got to know through those connected to Tate, who would support the Tate in building regional initiatives, regional networks of expertise, building our knowledge, and bringing works into the collection to tell a bigger story of modern and contemporary art. And we began with a committee that looked at Latin American art. Our second committee was Asia Pacific. Then we added the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, Russia, North America, and so on. And this has now provided us with an extraordinary funding base, entirely independent of government funds, entirely reliant on philanthropy, through which to build a collection that truly connects art across the world. And just to give you, that now is a map of the world with the circles representing areas of collections activity. So this huge diversification of the collection in a very, very short space of time. Of course, the big drive behind this was following the practice of contemporary artists. It's no longer possible to define contemporary art without this world picture. But of course, we always were, or my lifetime, a collection of historic art where our understanding was reflected through the lens of the present. So as we came to understand more and more about the contemporary practice of the world, so too we rethought those histories of art that underpinned those practices. And this is really important because at a time when many museums were beginning to buy globally in relation to contemporary practice, Tate took the decision that it would also buy back in time and would try and diversify and complicate the histories of art from those parts of the world. And really that's the project that I've been involved in over the last few years, and it's been an enormously exciting and gratifying journey to have been on with a group of absolutely brilliant curators and extraordinary collectors who've supported and at times guided us. So just to give you a snapshot of what we've been doing in Asia Pacific and South Asia, we have been acquiring work, I suppose, in 3 categories. The first, in chronologically category, is to look at those great moments of modern innovation across the world and key in the key artists who, as it were, the flag bearers of history. And this is a work by Susumu Kojimizu from Japan, who was associated with the Monaha group, which was a really radical group in the 1970s, following on the decades of post-war innovation. So a very important emergent figure who connects directly to history's contemporary moments in Europe and America. Then we have been acquiring really major figures, sort of mature figures of the contemporary scene. Of course, Ai Weiwei in China is an artist that we have worked with and now represent by, as it were, a monographic room collection of works. This was our most recent, penultimate acquisition, Sunflower Seeds, 2010. We've recently also acquired a large tree, currently on display in the new building. And then we also slightly tentatively, acquire work by emerging artists. And this was a work by the Shanghai-based collective Birdhead that we acquired in 2011. And you can see at the bottom of these slides how we've acquired those works, not with our dwindling government funds, but with these funds provided by our patrons. In relation to South Asia, Lionel Vent, an extraordinary Sri Lankan photographer, closely associated with the surrealist movement, enormously inventive practitioner, working with solarization of the image, incredible homoerotic images, almost unknown outside Sri Lanka and now South Asia, but incredibly important for the history of photography and the history of global surrealism. Mrilina Mukherjee, a very major significant artist, born in 1949, defining the nature of a sculpture by working with fiber, like so many women artists, innovating kind of on the borders, on the edges of the mainstream. And then finally, a much younger artist, Sheila Gowda, installation of human hair and car bumpers made in her native birth town of Bangalore, pointing to the kind of continuation of suspicion and folklore alongside modernity in current India. So single artists, all of whom define their place, define their moment in time, but allowing us to go back in time and knit these histories of Western practice into a more connected and nuanced and multifaceted vision of a kind of global history of art. At the same time, I talked about the way that in contemporary practice, the divisions between media are collapsing and more artists are working between different aspects of practice. Of course, that too has a history. So we've been looking back in time, trying to redefine the nature of these expanded fields. So Pino Galizio, who was one of the first artists in the 1950s to re-examine the nature of painting. Painting became performative, painting became industrial, painting became collaborative. Crystal Quilt by Suzanne Lacey in the 1970s and 80s, a feminist artist working with senior citizens, women, to make an object, to have a collective action, a work that sits between object and performance. Dianita Singh, a photographer in some ways of the old school, making work with silver gelatin prints just as they disappear from technology, but making her art in a way that invites the audience to come and intervene with the work, that invites spectators to become part of the installation of the artwork. So practices that refer back to history, but also challenge the nature of the contemporary museum. So with our new Tate Modern, 60% more space, and the reason for it, the growth in the collection, especially of large-scale immersive and interactive works, the changing profile of visitors. They spend more time, they want to get more involved, they're hungry for programs, they're hungry for engagement. And of course then the needs of donors and members, and above all, revenue sources like the MCA, like all museums. Tate is transitioning from being a publicly funded organization to being increasingly a self-enterprising, self-driven museum. So this new Tate has enabled curators really, again, to kind of reinvent the museum, to think about what we did in 2000 and build on that, bringing in many of these new, more international histories. And I just want to give you a little snapshot, 3 small snapshots of what that actually means. When we opened in 2000, we had a really innovative, provocative, engaging display. It was all about art from Europe and North America. So it was about that conventional history, kind of, put into new boxes. But the kind of stories we can tell now are very different. So this is just a display from 2009 with our kind of old collections, speaking of American and European art, Antiform and Arte Povera, with Giuseppe Panoni, Mario Merz, Richard Serra, Robert Morris, for example. We know this history. We're very familiar with it, the post-minimalist moment. But of course, it was a moment that engaged the world, and in particular, artists from Japan in dialogue with artists from America and Northern Europe. So now we're able to explore this, a view from Tokyo. So change the perspective, no longer just the view from London or New York, Turin, but here the view from Tokyo. Minimalism, we always showed its classic New York guys, Carl Andre's bricks, Robert Morris's mirror cubes, Donald Judd. Now in the new displays, this incredible moment of cosmopolitan minimalism where artists from Latin America, Germany, from Taiwan, here behind me from Spain, from France, from Rio, all exploring a similar terrain, demonstrating how, very vividly how, of course, from the 60s onwards, artists were in dialogue. Magazines circulated, artists traveled. These were discussions, debates that really were very connected across the world. It's not a history that can be owned from New York or from London. At the same time, the kind of way that we've shown works in the past, always behind barriers, always on plinths, is beginning to disappear in the new Tate. So I showed you a couple of slides ago, Robert Morris's mirror cubes behind a barrier. Now, cross our fingers just to see if it works. We have the mirror cubes in an open display, in an interactive form, returning that work that was so fundamentally important for that moment in the 1960s when art became active and artists began to ask their audiences to engage more deeply with the work of art. We're now returning the work, taking away the barrier, returning to work with that context. So the narrative of performance, time-based media, interactivity, inscribed right into the heart of the museum. And of course, then going back in time, we're equally able to tell a more international story. Here is a display from 2014 of the kind of late era of surrealism, sculptures by Germaine Richier, Picasso's The Free Dancer, early Jackson Pollock, a painting by Matter on the far wall. Now reconfigured in this new display, The Disappearing Figure, Art After Catastrophe, we begin to see that that moment we saw such radical change in Europe and North America had radical impacts right across the world. It wasn't just the Second World War, it wasn't just the atom bomb, it was also a profoundly disrupting moment of decolonization, defeat, despair. Artists such as Ibrahim El-Salahi in the back, far left, extraordinary modernist artist from the Sudan, somebody who took the appropriated tribal motif from Picasso and reappropriated it back into his painting, but with striking affinities in style and technique with artists from the Far East, the Middle East, Europe and America, an incredible global moment. And thinking about that bigger picture has, of course, unveiled, that wider lens has captured some incredible overlooked achievements by individuals. So the remarkable Anna Lupash, an extraordinary sculptor and a teacher working over many decades in Romania behind the Iron Curtain, which was not just a political curtain, but created this total invisibility of what, even under the most harsh years of communism, was an extraordinary avant-garde scene. Incredible work in Africa. This is a work by Jane Alexander, which speaks of the kind of presence of post-colonial torture, anxiety in contemporary South Africa. And then an artist like Silda Morelos from Sao Paulo, working with global networks and connections. So still this insistent presence of great bodies of work. To Rothko and Giacometti, we add Silda Morelos and Lupash. It's worth saying that this isn't a worldview. I don't believe we can really have a worldview any longer. All of us speak from a particular location at a particular time. And of course, each of us brings our bias, our age, our birth, our gender. I know I do. But it is no longer the case, I think, that a few authoritative voices, either art historians or curators, can tell us what's good or bad. So what is really at stake here is who holds the authority and how we reach out and explain with conviction what we're doing. And in order for us to do that persuasively, as we leave the canon and all the security that the canon brought us, what we're trying to do, I think, is put in place research that underpins our thinking, so we can demonstrate due diligence and knowledge that sits behind these innovations, these discoveries, but also dialogue. So dialogue means explanation, two-way discussion, and of course institutional collaboration. And these are the only ways that I think a museum such as Tate can demonstrate authority and trust. So I just wanted to quickly go through some of those partnerships. I was given this extraordinary, I hate this map actually, it looks like sort of like conquest of the world. Think of it the other way around. Think of it, the world is conquering the Tate. These are all the different kinds of institutional partnerships that we at Tate have undertaken or are undertaking at the moment, the different range of them. Exhibitions we make with other organizations, learning collaborations, international programs, research, training and consultancy. So although we are absolutely the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in London, we are a dispersed global institution, there's no question. Part of that is a fellowship scheme, working with young curators and scholars who come to London, who work with us. They bring their projects to us. They work on our projects with us. And there's schemes such as our GTB Bank relationship with curators and organizations across Africa. Here there's our curator, Zoe Whiteley, talking to a group of school children in Maputo last year. Then we have our Tate Research Center for Asia, run by Suk-Young Lee, who's here for the conference this time, who organizes reciprocal conferences and projects through much of the region. And of course, then we have initiatives such as Qantas, which is now bringing us into such sort of vital contact with this part of the world. Of course, I had to show you that. The best gallery in the world. I show you that really because we have this extraordinary response to Tate Modern, unbelievable, but the extraordinary response just, cranks up the challenge. The challenge is to deliver on the rhetoric. And how we do that, and what are the implications of taking one's cue from contemporary practice? If contemporary practice, of course, is the guide, if it shines the light, what does that mean? As T.S. Eliot argued in relation to canon formation, what happens when a new work of art is created is it impacts immediately on all the works of art that have preceded it. So just as we feel we have this point of accomplishment, we can and must allow for new readings of the past in light of the present. And I suppose I would argue that we can and must argue for a new kind of museum which can react to those new values and experiences of art. So Tate Modern will be a place where we continue to think and rethink again the histories of objects in our care, kind of an ever-changing constellation of stories. Of course, the collection is at the heart of what we do, always will be for me, and we hold it in trust for our public. So broadening access is fundamental, and of course what the biggest worry that I have in relation to Tate and to the museums that I visit is that we are in danger as we create ever more wonderful public programs and curate and ever more beautiful websites, is that we're in danger of super serving an elite. So how do we reach out and broaden that audience? How do we go out from the welcome that we already give to encourage people to come? And of course, in relation to a public institution, it's particularly important because we hold our collection in trust for the public. As life and art interface increasingly in the life of artists and the public, the new museum must present itself not just as a museum of objects, but a space for events. And it's a public space in an era of increasing privatization, and therefore it's a precious civic space. So what does that mean for the museum? Partly it means this. It means that people come in and perform in the space. Partly it means this, that we can engage with those audiences, galvanize them, create a moment of access between art and culture. But it also means this, that maybe as an institution we have to get more active. We need to speak out increasingly on behalf of artists and of the world of culture that we hold dear. If we do that, though, it also means this. It means that other people will come and use your building as a place for debate, a place of public protest, a civic space. I was thrilled that they said vote Remain. I wouldn't have been so happy if they'd said vote Brexit. So for me, we accept the latter. We accept that. We have to accept that, but we build on the former. We need to fight for what we believe in. And I'm especially proud that our first day was open to a public that has yet to come of age. So we had 3,000 school children from the length and breadth of the UK. There's been a huge decline in arts education in the UK, a significant reduction of funding, diminishing central support for the arts. So it was the philosopher and media theorist Boris Groys who described the traditional museum as a place of things and the contemporary museum as a place of events. Clearly, Tate is a place of both. But actually that opposition between the old museum and the new suggests, and maybe this is a kind of false suggestion, but just the words suggest, the institution as vested with power and authority over an audience which is receptive and passive. But as you can imagine, these children are not going to be passive. So surely there is a third possibility, and that is as a museum, as a place of exchange. The internet, we know, is becoming a place of sharing and debate. It's just beginning. It will increase. We don't know where it'll go. We're more and more accustomed to intervene in the virtual sphere, to react, to expect a reaction, to expect a response, to contribute and expect a commentary. So is it really feasible that museums remain untouched by this radical global transformation. So with MCA and Tate in a new relationship, it's a relationship that is built on collaboration and exchange, and the potential in wider collaboration and exchange with organisations beyond the visual arts and audiences in general is also the reason why in London, we've thrown open a whole floor of our new building to a venture working with over 50 associate organisations and curated in the opening year by the artist Tim Etchells. And we asked him to do a banner for Tate Exchange, and this is what he did. It's an open experiment. It's designed to dig down into the purpose, the impact of art on individual societies, why we make it, what we get from it, and how it can change lives. Can it change lives? These are important and profound questions to which we urgently need answers. Once we ask the question, of course, we have to listen, and if we listen, it'll change what we do. So give me a year or two, and that'll be the topic for my next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That was incredible and brought back many memories for myself being part of many of those debates when I worked in the UK. And now we have a time we're going to have a Q&A with Mark Ledbury. Mark is the Power Professor of Art History and Visual Culture at the University of Sydney and Director of the Power Institute. A lot of power there, Mark. He's a scholar of European art, particularly interested in the relations between art and theatre. He's the author of books and articles on François Boucher, Jacques-Louis David, and most recently on the British artist James Northcote. I love the title of his current book project, An Eccentric History of History Painting. As the director of the Power Institute, he curates a lively programme of publications, talks, conferences, workshops, and research projects in Sydney and internationally. Please welcome Mark, who's going to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes, it is. All good. Okay, this is going to be a very lively Q&A. There are many people here and many questions. I'm going to therefore keep my sort of introductory spiel brief. But I only just want to say that I think in your wonderful talk, Francis, the one thing you didn't do was really say something that I can say, which is that you yourself have, in a sense, been a sort of presiding intelligence in the way that Tate has turned sort of a history of modernism inside out and very productively realigned it through not only the 2000 first great hang, but the 2008 re-hang, and now 2016. And it's a very short space in which you've really shaken things up. And I think that the pace of that itself is somewhat telling. But I want to go back to something you said in 2008, which was this. You rather, I think, with a sort of wry smile, indicated that prisons and museums have a surprising amount in common. You were commenting on the fact that Millbank had been a prison site. Both of them, within them, both inmates and work of art are removed from their original habitats, their private spheres, and they are regulated and controlled. And I know that there was obviously irony in your voice, but in some ways, if there was some essential relation between kind of the imprisonment and the trapping of objects, what do you see as is the new Tate kind of community service for artworks? Is it sort of putting them at useful purpose? Is it freeing them in a supervised way? And what will the nature of that supervision need to be? How much must you control them and their reactions to them? How much will you really allow your new audiences kind of the freedoms, the intellectual and physical and other freedoms to roam?
Well, that's such a good question. I think the relationship between museums and prisons is an interesting one, and of course, in some ways, they date from the same era, and categorization and putting people in cells have a lot in common. And I think for many years, museum curators have and still do try and control the understandings and meanings that reside in those objects. And I think all of us are familiar with museum labels that tell you what to feel and tell you what to think and tell you what the artist means. And I think all of us in museums have to think very carefully about how we present works of art and how we accompany them with context. And context is really difficult because we do take works of art out of their context. Work of art is made at a particular time and place, has a relationship with the artist, then leaves the studio if it's made in the studio, and goes through a number of different relationships over time. And that is an enormously enriching process. Every artist who sees the work of art has a relationship with it and impacts on others. But you take a work out of that history and put it into the museum, and you limit the number of associations and meanings that can accrue, and therefore I think one of the roles that the curator can have is to try and open those up. It's the opening up, and one of the ways you can do that is very simply in writing texts that don't close meanings down. And another thing you can do is put works into juxtapositions or contexts. Give them contexts which might enrich their meanings, so that you think of a work of art in relation to another work of art. You can never go back in time, but you can refer to and infer those contexts. But the second part of your question really relates to thinking about what the future of the museum is in relation to encouraging and enabling a broader degree of audience participation. And I don't know what form that will take. And I think when I said we have an open experiment, I really do mean that. And we have taken the decision that we set up the terms of the experiment, and we will kind of see where we get. And we may be trialing some things. One of the things that we have recently done is we have like MCA, we have an app, and we're beginning to add some audio commentary. So we will be able to increase the number of voices in relation to the works of art, including the artist's voice, in a light touch way. And of course, the internet allows us to do an enormous amount of virtual curating. I don't think we ever have the resources to move works of art around the building on a daily basis, not even a monthly basis. But those relationships between works of art and commentaries should be things that we can become very experimental about and open up to debate.
And I'm sure there are many people in the curatorial professions and elsewhere who would want to come in now. So this is the next sort of slightly complex part of the procedure. I can see you much less easily than you can see me. So with your question, raise your hand high and wait until a microphone arrives in front of you. I'll try and catch your eye, and then I'll direct the mic to you. Yes, there is a hand up midway through here by this pillar.
Hello, Frances Kelly. I had the good fortune of being in London to see the new displays, and I just wanted to say congratulations, it's a triumph and a true expose of your collecting practice. But I wanted to ask you about the live works and the relationships that you've woven into the collection displays from the performative side of the contemporary art perspective, and in particular, say the difference in durations of display and cycles of conservation required for some of the earlier performative works that are more archival in nature, like Rebecca Horn and Marina Abramovic or Joan Jonas, and the more recent acquisitions of Roman Ondak and Tino Segal. And how you envisage, and I know it's an experiment and we'll see what's happened, but what kind of effect does that intermittence have on those correlations and couplings that you spoke about earlier? And what are the strategies for how that work remains kind of visible and is robust within the dialogical framework?
This is an excellent question, and one that goes to the addresses a real challenge for museums committed to embracing time-based practices within their permanent collection. I mean, obviously, there are many works of art that refer to performances through archival objects or documentation. So, for example, we have a work in the collection by Marina Abramovic, obviously you've seen it, where the performance element is a film screening, a video documentation of a performance that took place in New York in the 1970s, and it's accompanied by a physical archive of the objects that were part of that performance. So it has a sort of nice physical presence in the gallery, but the performance is merely a trace, a record, lost in time. And that's the way the artist has chosen the work to continue to exist. A work like Suzanne Lace's, which I showed you on screen, is a work that exists as a film documentation and through the quilt that was made during the performance, but also is a work that can be reperformed. So it's a work that we reperformed some years ago with the artist during residency. Then there are works of art in the collection, and this is increasingly the case with artists like Roman Ondak or Tino Segal, where the performance only exists during the duration of the performance. In fact, an artist like Tino Segal refuses to allow even photo or film documentation of the work. So there is no trace of the work, apart from the sort of sneaky social media images that a few people managed to get away with during the undertaking. So, and those works are really seminal and really, we've seen last night at the opening, there are performances now as part of the collection hang here. I think we can only hope to represent this moment in time adequately and show the kind of diversity of contemporary practice if we find a way of making those performances, deeply rooted in the experience of every visitor. And of course, at the moment, it's very simply a matter of resources that we only have the money to, hire the actors to make the performances on an occasional basis. So I and my colleague, Catherine Wood, who's our curator of Live, have a new strategy, shortly to be unveiled. It's called Collecting the Uncollectible. And we're looking for a way of funding the uncollectible, which really means those practices that you cannot collect in physical form, that you can only show in transitory moments. But it is just one of those, the great challenges of all of us who work with the visual arts is that, it sounds terribly depressing, isn't it? That we're getting back to the prison. The work leaves the real world and enters the prison, and there is a loss in transfer.
Thank you for the question. Please hold your hand up high. And a question over here. I'll try and be equitable in my viewing.
Thank you. First of all, for those of us who have been trying to work with a world art history or a more global perspective, I salute you. That was marvelous. But I also noticed over the period from the opening of Tate Modern, and you acknowledge this, there was a big shift towards the representation, and you've spoken about it, of global artists from around the world. How, and I know you have answers, so I ask you this with complete respect, how did you avoid simply in those juxtapositions positioning those artists at the so-called periphery as belated examples? How did you avoid setting those artists into a trap of belatedness by comparisons? What were your strategies? How did you do that?
Well, I think we changed the goalposts, simple as that. I mean, things are only belated if you begin with a particular time frame, or if it's about where you choose your starting point. And I was very conscious, over the last decade of conscious and increasingly irritated when colleagues or other, professionals talked about artists as sort of, too much as the legacy of. When you see the legacy of surrealism in Egyptian practices, or when you see the legacy of formal abstraction and actually the more time you spend in research, and myself and Sue and colleagues have done a huge amount of traveling and meeting people. The more time you spend with work from different places, you realize how different it is, and legacy isn't an adequate term. And one of the complete revelations for me installing this big space that we've got which we call between object and architecture, which looks at, okay, from a North American perspective, let's call it minimalism and its legacies. When you walk into that room and you start looking at the dates on the labels, you think, this is really interesting. So Lydia Clark did it first. So she was in Rio. Oh, that's really, Charlotte Poznanska, fascinating. Female German artist, never heard of her. What's she doing it before Donald Judd? So, it really is the case that there is this, there are these periods of time where things happen simultaneously or in a slightly different order. That's not always the case, but I think what we've tried to do is resist the idea that art history is a race, with a kind of, starting point and then being winners or losers. And it's just, let's get rid of that language. If you read our text, we have dispensed entirely with the language of modernism, and except where we need to refer to an actual moment, manifesto, or group. So we don't use that language, we don't use that structure, which is much more of a sort of network model. But of course, building on the strengths and pre-existing strengths in our collection, because, we celebrate the fact that our collection is in London and was built in the way it was done.
Right down here at the front.
Francis, I just want to go back to the last part of your talk where you summarised and said that museums, and specifically Tate, had undergone a shift over time from a place of things to a place of events to a place of exchange. I'm curious about the role of the curator within that process as perhaps catalysing, perhaps responding to, and I wonder if you could just talk about how the role of the curator might have shifted at this time.
Well, I think again, these are good questions. Of course, at the Tate, I don't know how things work in other museums, but the Tate, we have a group of curators who work with a collection and make exhibitions. Then we have a group of curators who make educational programs and learning. And what I think has been interesting at Tate is that many of the drive to, as it were, decolonize modernism, to use a modernist term, or, to create this bigger world picture, has really come from the curatorial side, who travel the world, who are interested in art history, who love making discoveries. When they find the Anna Lupash, it's just incredible. So that's been one driver, but the parallel driver that's really been pushing on how then you think about that has been coming from a hugely intelligent and committed learning team. And when we had a lovely sort of soft run for our new Tate Modern, when in 2012 we opened our oil tanks just for the Olympic period. And we ran for that year an experimental process of what we call collaborative programming. And for the first time, learning and curatorial teams work together. And actually what we discovered is that if you work together, you just double the amount of program. And so that was a kind of, we learned a lot. That's not how you do it, but you can learn from each other. And I think I, for one, have learned a huge amount from Anna Cutler and her team. And I think that this Tate Exchange that we're launching on October, which is principally the initiative of our learning team, has now been fully supported and backed by the curatorial team. And it's really the first time that a major initiative has come from learning, and the curators have, jumped on it, wanted to be part of it, rather than it being the other way around.
Thank you. I'm sure there are more. Yes.
Thank you for plugging the MCA app, by the way. We've worked very hard on that, and we love presenting the voice of the artist to our audiences. It's one of our key pleasures at the MCA. My question, however, is about the extensive private funding that you've managed to develop. If you develop those funding streams, does that encourage the public funding door to close?
You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. I don't know what the answer to that is. When I put the idea of moving the collection from its kind of conventional base to a much broader international remit, I was encouraged by the trustees, but they said, you don't have the resources to do this. If you want to do it, you have to self-fund. And so we began with about 6 collectors, and we worked from there. I don't think, in the scheme of things, it's hugely significant for the government that we do it. The government aren't really interested in culture any longer. Dare I say it?
But is a follow-up to that, what should we do about that, given that we feel it, and we feel it across many places? Is there, you asked the question about advocacy. Is the museum a space of advocacy and social intervention? And, in a way, what is it? Do you have any feelings on that, or are you feeling?
Oh, yes, no, I think when I showed you the image of Free Ai Weiwei and the image of the school children, I think it's enormously important that we are a space that takes a stand, and we have to be active advocates for the institution, for arts education, for the sector as a whole. But I also think that we need to be advocates for philanthropy. And, we support in London a huge population of wonderfully wealthy, endowed, happy people who benefit hugely from the Tate, and it's fantastic that some of them support and give back in return. So I think there is a mixed economy. One of the big drivers for Tate Exchange is that all of us, I'm sure, in this room, I would thought most of us anyway, believe that art can change lives. Florence Nightingale, writing from the battlefields of the Crimea, described the way that, beautiful pictures and colours helped people recover. And we've all seen it, we've all experienced it probably on our own lives, that sort of epiphany moment where you see the world differently, how you can become enormously engaged in images formally, but also the ideas and technologies. We know it's hugely important. So a space like Tate Exchange and the kind of questions that we will be interrogating and the way we will work with organisations are all set out to try and demonstrate to the world why art matters, what is its use value, so that we can convince governments and funders that it really matters, that it can change the world.
Here, I think there are many in this room who would agree with that. It's a question of how to open the ears of government. But is there other questions? Yes, there's a hand at the back, which I'm sorry, I took a little while to see. Excuse me.
I wondered whether you would just talk a little bit about Tate Exchange. Do you regard it as an alternative model to what other major flagships have done, like Louvre and Guggenheim, in terms of going offshore?
Yes, that's an interesting. We're not going offshore. As I said, we're done with bricks and mortar, certainly in London, and we've never had we've always shied away from the idea of exporting the building as a model, but we have welcomed the idea of international partnerships and exchanges, and I think that map of the world that I showed you demonstrated how that works. And although we have a finite number of relationships, they don't really coalesce into particular, affiliations with 3 or 4 places across the world. It's much more of a network model. Some of those relationships are partnerships between individuals or clusters of individuals. Some are between Tate and small organizations. Some are between Tate and large organizations. So Tate Exchange is, in a way, for the first time, it's establishing a group of collaborators who collectively will look at an agreed set of issues over a long period of time. And the really exciting thing, from my point of view, about Tate Exchange is, for the first time, they're not just visual arts organizations. So we're working with universities, with health centres, with local radios, with community arts organisations, a whole range of constituencies, all of whom connect through the visual arts for different reasons. So it's a completely different model to the Guggenheims of this world. And we initially begin it as a UK-based model, but we hope within 12 months, 24 months, we will then be able to roll out on a more interconnected international basis.
Sorry if I'm missing a hand, you'll have to, I'm sort of looking into lights here. While someone thinks of a very brilliant question, can I ask you first, is one of the things, just going back to one of the questions asked earlier, is the word modern now hampering you? Because if you believe that, if you like, we are looking at the contemporary and we're looking at its roots, there would be those that would argue that those roots do not necessarily begin with the works that begin the Tate's collection of non-British art. In other words, that those roots, that it's a sort of artificial kind of, it's an artificial structure that we've erected, this modernism, this modern, and that in fact that word is itself a problematic one given the contemporary and its deep and wide chronological roots.
Well, even if we accept the modern as a valid term, it didn't begin in 1900, where our collection begins. So, but we deal with the realities of collecting is that whatever Boris Groys says, it is still a collection of objects, and our collection of objects begins in 1900. But of course, the programs that we do, the thoughts that we have, the exhibitions that we make can range very widely, before that, and will in due course.
Please don't be shy. Once in a yes, thank you very much. There's a hand just about 3/4 of the way back. I'm sorry if I can't recognize or see your face. It's very...
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the MCA and Tate collaboration, and also your collecting of Australian art and perhaps even Aboriginal art as well.
Perhaps even. Yes. What can I tell you about that? This was, well, Lisanne may want to correct me, and feel free to do so at any stage. Interestingly, Lisanne and I had a nice encounter about 3 years ago at the Berlin Biennial, when we happened to bump into each other, and I had just really had a sort of one of those epiphany moments in the presence of Gordon Bennett, and whose work I just found completely extraordinary. And I think I said, we just have to find a way of acquiring the work. And tragically, really days later, I think he died. But weeks later, Lisanne rang me up and said, hey, or emailed me and said that there was a plan afoot to create an initiative to acquire Australian work with the support of Qantas and share it with an international museum, and would Tate be interested? And of course, it was a no-brainer. I just thought how extraordinary that we've been trying to think of a way of engaging more deeply with Australian art for some time as part of our widening remit. And here is a project that would help us, bring us some funds, but as important as the funds, would connect us to an institution which is really deeply embedded in the landscape here and has a group of curators who really know what they're talking about. And I think that was the draw was it was really why that is important is that whenever we've made these initiatives, and we've done them initially very tentatively, because we felt it was absolutely crucial in approaching a new area, not just a sort of, get on a plane and jump in and go shopping at the next, whatever, Miami Art Fair or Hong Kong, Basel Art Fair, but to really know the territory, meet the artists, spend time, do research, get connected, network locally, and get a real sense of how, how, why, and to what degree the work we're looking at could be connected to the stories that we were already collecting. So what was rather brilliant about this, as I say, was that it was an initiative that brought us not just funding, but all those networks that in other places have taken us a very, very long time, blood, sweat and tears to originate. So the way the scheme has worked is that a small group of curators from Tate, led by Suk-Kyung Lee, have undertaken a number of visits to Australia and worked with Natasha here and other colleagues at MCA to put together really a joint strategy. And it's been an interesting process because we are very different organizations. Our remits are very different and we're in very different parts of the world. So we agreed early on that it would only make sense if we were able to identify works of art and artists who were important, perhaps for different reasons, but equally important for both organizations. There's been a really interesting, discussion around many of the individuals and practices that we've been looking at. And we decided that the project will span 5 years, and every year we will select a small group of works, and it's really important that those works are deeply valued by both organizations and will contribute in different ways. So, for example, works by Gordon Bennett acquired for MCA add to a group of works already in the collection and strengthen that group of works. And it was very important that these 2 paintings brought new aspects of the artist's work into the collection. For Tate, they are the artist's first acquisitions, the first time we could represent Bennett, and it felt very important to represent him by a very politically engaged, as it were, history painting. You can comment on that. And a painting of formal abstraction. So it would offer us 2 different ways of showing the artist, 2 different contexts, bring Australian art into 2 different narratives at Tate, but also allow us to show 2 aspects of the artist were we to show those paintings together. It's interesting that the first year of acquisitions certainly address indigeneity, and there are a number of urban Aboriginal artists in that package. One of the things that I've been really fascinated to begin to think about on this visit is how Aboriginal art might fit into the equation. And that's the beginning of a thought process and a series of conversations that we will have over the next few years. So it is, as I said earlier, that the research is incredibly important because it's not, we have to resist the idea of just going shopping. Every single work will be in the collection, in our collection, in perpetuity. And it's a 5-year window of opportunity. So every single acquisition must be incredibly important, tick lots of boxes, and be in the collection forever.
Can I ask you a self-interested question, right? What is the relationship between your, I think, rather radical reconfiguring of the museum, the tales the museum tells about the history of art, and how we teach the history of art more widely in schools, if we ever get to teach it, or at universities? What is the ideal relationship between you and a university or an environment where we teach art history in the larger community?
Well, yeah, I don't know whether I can answer that question, really. I do. When we opened Tate Modern, a number of my friends and colleagues from art history departments in the UK were terribly upset with what we had done, because they said that we'd sort of, they always loved using Tate as a sort of dull, dusty library resource where they could bring their students and stand in front of our displays and say, honestly, this isn't how it should be done, or
we can be nicely anti-museum and say how stuffy you were.
sort of, and you could write much more dynamic and exciting histories, and you could be like Andre Malraux and reference any work from any part of the world and reinvent art history. But, you wrote in such compelling ways that we began to listen. And so, I think we responded in our collection hang to a lot of the messages and thoughts we were getting from art history. I think we work very closely with art historians in London. I think curators are different. We deal with objects. We deal with objects in space. The materiality of the object is incredibly important. And I don't, although I'm, from top to bottom an art historian, and I was trained as one, I don't think the purpose of the museum is to teach art history. It's to provide, really compelling experiences of art and culture in real time to a whole array of different types of people. And in a way, the displays are it's a framework. It's like designing a really accessible, interesting house that you walk into. You don't trip up over the front door. The doors open beautifully. You understand why the curtains are in the way. It's about putting things into a sequence that is logical, transparent, and if you want to think about the sequence, it actually is really interesting too, and might take you into, another room or around the corner or up the stairs, and then another encounter.
We have room for maybe time for another couple of questions, yeah? Oh, sorry, there's one at the back here that I may have missed earlier, and then I'll come to you, sir, after that.
Thank you very much. This question probably just leads on from your points that you've just made about museum attendance. Now, the Tate Modern clearly is enjoyed one of the highest attendance rate that's been recorded. In terms of the other facets of museum attendance rate, how do you think that can be used as a guide to get support in terms of funding, which is a problem we have in this country? So I'm just wondering from your experience in the UK in particular. Thank you.
Well, we try and use our very high visitor figures to demonstrate to the government what an important resource we are in terms of tourism. And a key, I think Tate Modern is one of the key, attractions for visitors coming to the city. And London is a city that depends very heavily on tourism. I don't think we exist for tourists, but I think it's fantastic that we can be an organisation that changes the lives of people who only come for a day on their visit to London. And I know that I'm a tourist in other parts of the world, here in Sydney, when I go to New York, in Tokyo, I go to their great museums. I am a tourist, and I'm hugely grateful. And the experience on those days is enormously important. So I think that constituency, and it's a very high number of our audience who are tourists, once in a lifetime or once a year tourists, is incredibly important. It isn't an argument that seems to be taken very seriously by our funding bodies, though it is nevertheless there. But we need to do more work about demonstrating exactly what that means. I think for the Tate, we have had a huge impact on tourism to our part of London, and an even bigger impact on the economic regeneration of the whole of the Southwark area. It's been phenomenal. The real estate development in the wake of Tate Modern has been astonishing. It's not something I particularly welcome. I don't particularly want to be surrounded by unbelievably opulent blocks of apartment buildings, but we have been a magnet to other developers.
Okay, I think we might need to move to our last question, and then I think that'll be the last one for the night.
We've all been to those restaurants and bars where the music is so loud that you can't actually talk. Now, I've often believed that the music is for the waiters and waitresses, not for the customers. I wonder whether the emphasis on the museum as a place of events rather than exhibitions, rather than a place for objects, isn't taking us a little bit too far in that direction. Because I've had this experience, not at the Tate, because I haven't been to London for 2 or 3 years now, pardon me, but over the last couple of years of going to a museum like the Stedelijk, where I've been twice, wanting to see particular works, favourite works, wonderful things that I remember well, and finding those works are not up, but gallery after gallery after gallery is devoted to some relatively contemporary, conceptual, ephemeral work. I think what worries me as a sometime tourist to the European museums and galleries is that there can be such an emphasis on finding things which are actually fascinating and exciting and interesting for curators to do, that curators are busy, are active, are getting the feel-good factor, feel like they're including the rest of the world and looking everything in there, that in fact a lot of the great things that one wants to see in a fantastic collection like the Tate, or indeed of some of the other great European museums, are no longer on display or are temporarily down. So when you are a tourist and you turn up at the door, you don't see what you want to see, and you find yourself frustrated by the amount of new, groovy, cool things that are there instead. Now that may be very, very interesting if you're there every day of the week, but if you're there once every 2 or 3 years, it's a source of frustration. So I think, is there some argument for a little bit of balance?
I think there's a very, very strong argument for a little bit of balance, and I think you probably put it in rather black and white terms, but I think it's hugely important that we remain a wonderful place for overseas visitors to come, or people from the north of England who might not come very often, so they can see their treasured, the great works that we associate with Tate Modern. And we do have around 200 works, for example, that are more or less on permanent view. It's incredibly important. It's not just important that they are there for visitors, but they are there for the dialogues and connections they make with the more ephemeral works. Because as I said, artists don't work in vacuums. So, artists want to see those works as well. Artists want their work to be seen in that context. So there is a balance. But likewise, it's incredibly important that even national museums like Tate are local museums, that they do serve the people in their neighborhoods, that they serve the city in which they take place. And I think it's incredibly important that museums like the Tate have sufficient traction through their programs, both educational programs, but also participatory activities, film programs, events that provides a lure that's as compelling and as powerful as the shopping mall down the road. Because that's the reality, is that kids these days will go and hang out in the shopping mall. And it's really important that the museum becomes a place of encounter, of socializing, of meeting friends, of engaging with art, new and old. And the balance is in calibrating those factors.
Thank you very much, and for honour those inspiring words. I think we should thank Frances and everyone involved in bringing you here.
Yes. Inspiring indeed. Frances confided, and I think she said it in an interview, that her ambition at the Tate Modern was to have a 50-50 hang of women and men artists. So I'm afraid the days of the overwhelming majority of work being by dead white men is over. Sorry, guys. Incredible. And it resonated so much also with me. I once was involved in an exhibition of a South American artist, and I remember somebody coming in and huffing and puffing about the fact that it was Joseph Beuys, a pale imitation of, and I just said, look at the label. And of course the date was 10, 15 years before Joseph Beuys. So those discussions are so important, how we open up, and at the same time, as Frances has said, maintain our quality, our research, our commitment to artists, our commitment to great works of art. I don't think there's anything we've heard tonight that doesn't say we shouldn't still really care about the objects in our collections, and we do, which is why we've organised this wonderful conference, which many of you here today are going to be here with us for the next couple of days. And if you haven't seen the beautiful rehang upstairs of the MCA's collections, a little snapshot of the many works that we hold, also, I believe, although coming often from private funds in our case, very much hold for the people of Australia and our international visitors. Please go and see the show over the forthcoming months, because it's really fantastic. Mark, you did a great job. Thank you. It's wonderful. Mark, of course, with the Power Institute being such a part of the MCA's history. and us still having a great relationship with the Power, both in terms of its collections and, of course, its personnel. So thank you, Mark. But Frances, really, what an honour to have had you here. Great friend and colleague, great inspiration. Please join me in formally thanking her.